Imagine standing at the airport gate, ready to board, when suddenly you're pulled aside. Your ticket is fine, but you're told you're not on the list. This is the story of Colonel Maya, and what happens next is about to blow your mind. Colonel Maya Roberts walked through the airport with quiet determination. Dressed in civilian clothes, a black leather jacket over a plain white t-shirt and dark jeans, she moved with the effortless confidence of someone used to taking command. But today, she wasn't looking for any kind of special treatment. She was just another passenger, blending into the crowd, ready to board a flight like anyone else. She adjusted her duffel bag over her shoulder and glanced at the time on her phone. She was heading to an important military summit where she was scheduled to speak on one of the topics she was most passionate about: diversity in the armed forces. As one of the few black women to rise to the rank of colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, Maya had lived the struggle she was about to discuss. The summit was a big deal, and her speech would be critical, not just for her career, but for the broader conversation about race, gender, and leadership in the military. But she wasn't focused on that right now. First, she needed to get through the airport.
Maya's decision to dress down wasn't random. She knew from experience that wearing her uniform often brought extra attention, both good and bad. People tended to look at her differently when they saw the insignia on her chest, either with admiration for her rank or with quiet skepticism about how someone like her could have risen to such a position. Today, she wanted neither. She wanted to move through the airport anonymously, without the weight of judgment or the burden of assumptions.
As she stepped through the sliding glass doors of the airport, she adjusted her duffel bag on her shoulder and inhaled deeply, savoring the cool, filtered air. The bustling crowd of travelers swirled around her, families rushing to catch flights, business people hunched over their phones, and vacationers with sun-kissed faces and bright luggage. Maya slipped into the flow, moving with a sense of purpose. Her thoughts were already on her speech, the message she would deliver to an audience of senior military officials, many of whom had spent their careers seeing leadership through a narrow lens. She intended to broaden that lens. She made her way toward the security checkpoint, where a long line of travelers snaked around the queue barriers. Maya joined the line, her expression calm and collected. She could feel eyes on her now and then, people taking in the striking figure of a tall, athletic black woman with a serious demeanor. But no one lingered too long. She wasn't drawing attention because of her rank, just the quiet confidence that radiated from her. She preferred it that way. As the line moved forward, Maya approached the TSA officer and handed over her boarding pass and identification. The officer, a young man in his early 20s, glanced at her ID, then at her, his eyes briefly widening when he realized who she was.
"Thank you, Colonel,"
he said, his voice respectful as he handed her documents back. Maya offered a polite nod in response, but nothing more. The less attention she drew to herself, the better. The officer waved her through, and she smoothly navigated the security screening process, retrieving her bag and shoes from the conveyor belt with practiced efficiency. By the time she reached her gate, her mind had fully shifted to the task ahead. She mentally rehearsed key points of her speech, fine-tuning the message she hoped would resonate with those in the room, people who had the power to shape the future of the military. This was a conversation that was long overdue, one she had been pushing for since the early days of her career. The need for diversity and inclusion in the ranks was no longer a suggestion. It was a necessity for the future of the armed forces. As she neared the gate, she noticed the airline staff assisting passengers as they checked in for the flight. She was early, with plenty of time to relax before boarding. Maya found a seat nearby and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her email to confirm final details about the summit. The minutes ticked by quietly, and soon enough, the first announcement for boarding came over the loudspeaker.
First-class passengers, please make your way to the boarding area.
Maya stood in line, her first-class ticket in hand, as the crowd bustled around her. The plane was boarding, and she felt the familiar rhythm of the pre-flight routine. Passengers gathering their bags, checking their phones, and slowly shuffling toward the gate. She wasn't thinking about the earlier tension at the check-in counter. She had already moved on, focusing on her upcoming speech. She had boarded hundreds of flights before, and this one would be no different. Or so she thought. As Maya approached the gate, the same airline employee from earlier was there, scanning tickets. The woman's eyes landed on Maya again, and this time, there was no mistaking the hesitation.
Excuse me.
The gate agent said, as Maya stepped forward, her voice filled with thinly veiled skepticism.
Are you sure you're in the right line? This is for first-class passengers.
Maya froze for just a moment. The question wasn't new to her, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. She had heard those words before, whether spoken outright or implied in the doubtful looks of others. But here, at the gate of a commercial flight, it stung in a way that was hard to shake.
That's why I'm in this line.
The gate agent looked down at the ticket in her hand, as if still not quite convinced. She glanced up again, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to figure out what was wrong.
I'll need to see your ID.
She said, her tone clipped. Maya handed over her ID without a word, keeping her expression neutral, despite the frustration simmering beneath the surface. She knew what was happening. She had seen it 1,000 times before. People who couldn't reconcile her appearance with her achievements. People who questioned her place in spaces that weren't meant for someone like her. The gate agent scrutinized the ID for an uncomfortably long time, her expression hard to read. Maya waited, her patience wearing thin, but her composure intact. She had no intention of causing a scene, but she also wasn't about to let this moment pass without standing her ground. Finally, the woman handed the ID back, but her hesitation remained.
I'll have to check with my supervisor.
She said, her voice still carrying that same edge of doubt. Maya stood motionless, her eyes locked on the gate agent who had just walked away to confer with her colleagues. She could hear fragments of their conversation, their voices lowered but not enough to keep her from picking up pieces.
I'm not sure about this. We need to verify.
The words hung in the air, fueling a rising frustration deep within Maya. She had been through this before, too many times in fact. The doubt, the skepticism, the disbelief that someone who looked like her could possibly hold the rank she did. Maya wasn't wearing her uniform, but she didn't need to. Her military ID should have been more than enough to put any questions to rest. But here she was, waiting for a decision that seemed to be based on assumptions rather than facts. The minutes dragged on, and Maya could feel the weight of time pressing down on her. She had made sure to arrive at the airport early, giving herself more than enough time to board her flight, but now that cushion was shrinking. She glanced at the large clock mounted on the wall. The boarding time was approaching, and she couldn't afford to miss this flight. If she did, the consequences could be severe. Missing the summit wasn't an option. She shifted her weight slightly, resisting the urge to let out a frustrated sigh. Her composure was intact, but inside, it felt like a storm brewing. Maya had spent years mastering the art of staying calm under pressure, both on and off the battlefield. But there were moments like this when that discipline was tested. Being second-guessed, scrutinized, and doubted wasn't new to her, but that didn't make it any easier. As the gate agent continued talking with her colleagues, Maya's thoughts drifted back to her years in the military. From her earliest days in basic training to her eventual rise to the rank of colonel, she had encountered obstacles that others hadn't. Being a black woman in the Marine Corps had meant fighting battles on two fronts. First, as a soldier proving her worth on the field, and second, as a woman of color fighting to be seen as an equal in the eyes of those around her. Her successes had been hard-earned, and every step forward had come with its share of challenges. She overheard the gate agent say,
I don't know if someone like her can be a colonel.
The words stung, even though she had no right to be surprised by them. It was exactly the kind of coded language she had heard before, the kind that revealed the deeper prejudices people harbored but rarely spoke aloud. Maya felt her muscles tense involuntarily. Someone like her? What did they mean by that? She knew the answer, of course. The assumption was clear. Someone like her didn't fit their idea of what a colonel should look like. Someone like her didn't belong in first class. Someone like her wasn't supposed to have risen through the ranks of the Marine Corps. But Maya did belong here. She had earned her place, and she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. She checked the time again. The window for boarding was closing, and the delay was becoming more than just an inconvenience. She was supposed to be at the summit in a few hours, standing in front of some of the most influential military leaders in the country, delivering a speech that could shape the future of diversity in the armed forces. Missing the flight wasn't an option. Maya's mind raced. She knew that the weight of the situation went beyond her personal frustration. This wasn't just about a missed flight or a moment of doubt. It was about the systemic issues that kept surfacing, the unspoken biases that still existed within institutions like the airline and the military. And here she was, yet again, having to prove herself, having to convince others that she belonged. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity before the gate agent returned, her expression neutral, but her words cut.
We're still waiting for confirmation. Please, be patient.
She said, as though Maya's military ID and first-class ticket were nothing more than props in an elaborate charade. Maya nodded, though every part of her wanted to say something. She wanted to challenge the agent, to ask what kind of confirmation they were waiting for. But she knew that pushing back too hard could escalate the situation, and she needed to stay composed. This wasn't the time to lose her cool. She glanced around at the other passengers. Some were watching her now, curiosity and confusion written across their faces. Others whispered among themselves, clearly aware that something wasn't right. Maya felt their eyes on her, felt their judgments forming, but she refused to let it rattle her. She had faced far worse than this. She could handle a few stares, but as the seconds ticked by, the weight of the situation bore down on her. She had been through this before, too many times. The suspicion, the judgment, the constant need to prove herself over and over again. It was exhausting. Finally, the gate agent returned, accompanied by a security officer.
Ma'am,
The officer said, his tone neutral but firm.
we need to see your ID again.
Maya's frustration flared, but she handed over her ID without a word. This was absurd. She had already shown her credentials, yet here they were, questioning her identity again. It was clear that they were doubting more than just her ticket. They were doubting her very right to be here. The officer examined the ID carefully, turning it over as if looking for something that would discredit her. Maya stood there, her patience wearing thin, but she kept her expression calm. She knew how this looked. A black woman in civilian clothes, standing in first class, being questioned by airport security. She could feel the assumptions hanging in the air, but she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. The officer looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly.
You're a colonel?
He asked, the skepticism evident in his voice.
Yes,
Maya replied, her tone steady.
I'm a colonel in the United States Marine Corps. I'm heading to a military summit, and I can't afford to miss this flight.
The officer didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the ID again, then back at her. Maya could see the doubt in his eyes, and it infuriated her. What more did they need? Her credentials were right there in front of them. She had done nothing wrong. But the fact that she was a black woman seemed to override everything else. The gate agent spoke up again, her voice laced with condescension.
We just need to be sure, ma'am. You understand, right?
Maya forced herself to stay calm.
I understand that you're questioning my credentials, even though I've shown you everything you've asked for.
She said, her voice measured but firm.
I'm a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, and I need to be on that flight.
The security officer shifted uncomfortably, his expression caught somewhere between doubt and awkwardness. Maya could tell he wasn't quite sure how to proceed. It wasn't that her credentials were suspicious. It was that they didn't fit the narrative he'd already formed in his head. The gate agent, sensing the tension but not willing to back down, leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if trying to sound reasonable.
We have to be cautious. You understand. It's just unusual, that's all. We don't want to make any mistakes here.
Maya took a deep breath. She knew what they were trying to say without saying it, that they couldn't reconcile her appearance, her civilian clothes, and her blackness with the rank and status she had rightfully earned. But instead of addressing the racial undertones directly, they hid behind vague concerns about protocol and verification. She glanced around again, noticing how the other passengers were becoming more engaged in the spectacle. A few had their phones out, possibly recording the interaction. She could feel the judgment radiating from the crowd, not because they understood what was happening, but because they were forming their own narratives. The angry black woman trope, the assumption that she was in the wrong, all built on nothing but the surface of the situation.
Look,
Maya said, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of her frustration.
I've shown you everything I need to. My military ID, my boarding pass, everything is in order. What exactly is the problem here? Do you need something more? Or are you just doubting me because you don't think someone like me can be a colonel?
The question hung in the air, sharp and pointed. The gate agent shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing slightly as she exchanged a glance with the security officer. The confrontation had reached a point where the racial undercurrents could no longer be ignored, and Maya's directness left no room for polite deflection. The security officer cleared his throat.
Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We have protocols to follow.
Well, your protocol seems to be based more on suspicion than fact.
Maya responded.
I'm not a threat. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to board my flight, the same as everyone else here.
The tension in the air was palpable. For a moment, the entire boarding area seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maya could feel the pressure building inside her, the exhaustion of having to explain herself again and again. But she knew she couldn't lose her temper. That would only play into the narrative they were already constructing, that she was out of line, that she was aggressive. Maya could feel the heat rising in her chest, the frustration mounting with each second. She had been patient, more than patient. She had handed over her ID and her ticket and calmly explained who she was. But none of it seemed to matter. None of it ever seemed to matter. The security officer stood a few feet away, shifting uncomfortably, unsure of what to do next. The gate agent, still holding her ID and ticket, glanced at him with uncertainty, her fake smile now long gone. They were stuck in this moment, a moment Maya knew all too well. A moment where no matter what she said, no matter what evidence she provided, she was seen not as Colonel Maya Roberts, a respected leader in the U.S. Marine Corps, but as a black woman who, in their eyes, couldn't possibly be in first class, let alone a colonel. Maya took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure, but it was becoming harder with each passing second. She wasn't just dealing with this situation. She was dealing with the weight of all the times she had faced this before. The countless moments of doubt, the countless times she had been questioned for no reason other than the fact that she didn't look like what they expected. The emotional toll was building up, threatening to crack through her composed exterior.
You have to understand, ma'am. This is just procedure. We need to be sure, you know. We can't be too careful nowadays.
Maya narrowed her eyes.
Careful of what, exactly?
The agent blinked, taken aback by the directness in Maya's voice.
Well, you know, we just need to make sure everything is in order. With the current climate and all.
The current climate.
Maya repeated, her voice dangerously calm.
What exactly do you mean by that?
The security officer stepped forward, trying to intervene.
Ma'am, it's not personal. It's just unusual for someone like you to be in this situation.
Maya's heart skipped a beat, the words echoing in her head. Someone like you. There it was. The truth slipped out in a moment of awkward honesty. The facade of politeness had crumbled, and Maya could see exactly what they were thinking. She could see the assumptions they were making, the narrative they had already built in their minds. Someone like her wasn't supposed to be a colonel. Someone like her wasn't supposed to have a first-class ticket. Someone like her didn't belong here. The heat in her chest turned into a burning anger. She had tried to keep calm. She had tried to be patient. But now, standing in front of these people who refused to see her for who she was, the anger was bubbling up uncontrollably. She could feel it rising, taking over, and before she could stop herself, the words came tumbling out.
I've shown you my ID. I've shown you my ticket. I've explained who I am. But it's still not enough for you, is it? Because I don't look like what you expect, right? Because I'm a black woman standing here, and you can't wrap your heads around the idea that I've earned my place. Is that it?
The gate agent took a step back, her eyes widening. The security officer shifted uncomfortably again, but he didn't speak. The silence that followed was heavy and tense, as if everyone in the airport had stopped to witness the confrontation unfolding. Maya could feel the stares of the other passengers on her now, the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, capturing every moment as if it were some kind of spectacle. She could hear the murmurs, the whispers spreading through the crowd.
She's losing it.
Isn't she overreacting? Typical.
Those whispers hurt more than the confrontation itself. Maya had seen this play out before and knew exactly what they were thinking. In their eyes, she wasn't a victim of racial profiling or systemic prejudice. She was just an angry black woman, overreacting, making a scene. No one saw the years of patience, the years of composure, the years of holding herself back to avoid becoming exactly what they expected her to be. But now, she couldn't hold it in anymore, and it felt both liberating and painful at the same time.
You think I don't know what's happening here?
Maya continued, her voice rising slightly, her anger palpable.
You think I haven't faced this before? I've spent my entire career proving myself, and every time I walk into a room, people like you look at me and question whether I belong. But let me tell you something. I do. I've earned my place, and no amount of your suspicion or your ignorance is going to take that away from me.
The gate agent tried to respond, her voice shaky now.
Ma'am, we didn't mean anything by it.
Didn't you?
Maya shot back.
You've questioned me, delayed me, humiliated me in front of all these people, and you still don't see what the problem is?
The murmurs grew louder now, the crowd fully engaged in the spectacle. Maya could feel the judgment radiating from them, but at this point, she didn't care. She had had enough. Enough of the polite deflections, enough of the subtle racism hidden behind bureaucracy, enough of being treated like she didn't belong. She noticed a few passengers standing by the gate, some looking sympathetic, others casting accusatory glances. The tension in the air was thick, and then, almost predictably, the situation escalated further. Another gate agent approached, flanked by 2 airport police officers. Maya saw them coming from a distance, and her heart sank. It was as if her worst fears were materializing in real time. She knew what this would look like to the crowd. The officers were here because of her, not because she was in the right, but because she was the problem they needed to solve. The officers, dressed in their Navy uniforms, stepped forward, one of them addressing Maya with a neutral expression. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside for further verification," the officer said, his tone calm but authoritative. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Maya clenched her fists at her sides, the anger bubbling up once again.
I've already shown them everything they need to see. I've given my ID and my military credentials. I'm not stepping aside. I've done nothing wrong.
The second officer, a taller man with a stern face, stepped in closer.
"Ma'am, we're just trying to resolve this situation. If you could step aside, we can clear this up quickly."
Clear it up?
Maya's voice cracked slightly with frustration.
There is nothing to clear up. I've done everything by the book, and yet you're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal.
By now, the scene had drawn even more attention. More phones were recording, more people were watching, and the situation had spiraled into something Maya hadn't wanted but could no longer control. She was angry, rightfully angry, but to everyone watching, she was just the angry black woman who was causing a disturbance. She could feel the emotional toll weighing on her. Memories of past encounters with systemic prejudice flashed through her mind. Times when her qualifications had been questioned. Times when she had been overlooked or underestimated, all because of her race and gender. She remembered the subtle digs, the microaggressions, and the quiet doubts that had followed her throughout her career. This moment was just the latest in a long line of indignities she had had to endure. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself, trying to regain control. She didn't want to be seen as the angry black woman. She had spent years avoiding that label, keeping her composure in the face of countless provocations. But now, standing here, being questioned and doubted once again, she couldn't hold it back.
Ma'am?
The first officer repeated. "We need you to come with us." Maya took a deep breath. She had a choice to make. She could walk away quietly, step aside, and let them verify her credentials once again. But she knew what that would mean. It would mean letting them win, letting them continue to believe that she didn't belong, that she wasn't who she said she was. Or she could stand her ground. Maya straightened her posture, her chin lifting slightly as she made her decision.
I'm not going anywhere.
She said, her voice firm and unwavering.
I'm a colonel in the United States Marine Corps. I'm heading to a military summit, and I will not be treated like a criminal just because you can't accept that.
The officers exchanged a glance, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension hung heavy in the air, the entire scene feeling like it was balanced on the edge of a knife. But Maya knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. For a brief moment, the entire airport seemed to fall silent. The words cut through the tension like a knife. The security personnel, the gate agents, and even the passengers who had been watching and recording the scene seemed to freeze. The power in her words and the authority in her tone left no room for doubt. Maya wasn't asking for permission or pleading for validation. She was asserting her rightful place, demanding the respect she had earned. The security officer shifted awkwardly, his face flushing with uncertainty. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. The gate agent, who had been so confident just moments ago, now looked unsure of herself, her fake professionalism crumbling in the face of Maya's undeniable authority. She opened her mouth to say something but quickly closed it, realizing that anything she might say would only make the situation worse. Maya's rank hung in the air, its weight palpable. The phrase United States Marine Corps echoed in the minds of everyone present. This wasn't just an ordinary traveler they were dealing with. She wasn't someone they could dismiss or brush aside. She was a high-ranking officer in one of the most respected military forces in the world, and they had just spent the last 20 minutes treating her like an imposter. The tension broke as the security officer finally responded, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic.
Colonel Roberts, we didn't realize.
He stumbled over his words, clearly flustered.
I'll get the supervisor immediately. There's been a misunderstanding.
Maya didn't let him off the hook that easily.
A misunderstanding?
She repeated, her voice edged with disbelief.
No, what's happening here is more than just a misunderstanding. You questioned my credentials because of your assumptions about who I am and what I'm supposed to look like. Let's not pretend this was anything other than what it was.
The officer's face reddened, and he turned quickly, muttering something into his radio as he stepped away. The gate agent stood frozen, staring at Maya with wide eyes, her hands fidgeting with the stack of boarding passes on the counter. There was a shift in the room now, a visible change in the way people were reacting to Maya. The security personnel, the airline staff, and even some of the passengers watching from a distance were beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about one woman being inconvenienced at an airport gate. It was about power, authority, and the deep-seated prejudices that had fueled this entire ordeal. Maya crossed her arms, refusing to move until someone in charge arrived. She wasn't just going to let this slide. Not this time. The exhaustion of having to prove herself, time and time again, was wearing on her. But she wouldn't let them see that. Not now. She couldn't afford to appear vulnerable in a situation where she had to maintain control. After a few minutes of tense silence, a supervisor arrived. A woman in her 50s with a professional demeanor and an air of efficiency about her. Her expression was serious as she approached Maya, her eyes flicking briefly to the security officers before landing on the gate agent.
Colonel Roberts, I apologize for the situation you've encountered.
The supervisor said, her voice carefully measured.
I've been informed of the issue, and I'll make sure it's resolved immediately.
Maya studied the woman for a moment before responding.
I appreciate the apology, but an apology alone doesn't erase what's happened here. I've been delayed, disrespected, and subjected to unnecessary scrutiny because of assumptions based on nothing but my appearance. This is more than just a mistake. It's systemic, and it needs to be addressed.
The supervisor nodded, looking genuinely concerned.
You're absolutely right. This should never have happened. We'll be conducting a full review of the actions taken by the staff involved. I'll personally ensure that you are cleared to board, and I'll make sure this doesn't happen again.
Maya could hear the sincerity in the woman's voice, but the anger that had been building inside her was still simmering. She wasn't naive enough to believe that one conversation would change the system that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. But at the very least, she was making it clear that she wasn't going to tolerate being treated like this. Not today. Not ever. The supervisor turned to the gate agent, who was still visibly shaken by the confrontation.
Please clear Colonel Roberts to board immediately,
she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. The gate agent fumbled with the computer for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she processed Maya's boarding pass. Finally, she handed it back to her, avoiding eye contact.
You're all set to board now, ma'am,
she said quietly, her voice a shadow of the condescending tone she had used earlier. Maya took the boarding pass without a word, though the silence between them spoke volumes. The gate agent knew what she had done, and there was nothing left to say that could undo it.
Maya didn't need her validation. She had her dignity, and that was more than enough.
As Maya turned to walk toward the jet bridge, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse. Some of the passengers who had been recording the interaction on their phones looked away awkwardly, realizing that the situation had shifted in a way they hadn't anticipated. A few of them murmured apologies as Maya passed, but most remained silent, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed. The exhaustion hit her all at once. The emotional toll of having to fight for her legitimacy, of having to prove once again that she deserved to be in the space she was in, weighed heavily on her. She had come to the airport that day hoping for a routine flight, but instead, she had been forced to confront the same prejudices she had been battling her entire career. And though she had won this particular battle, the fatigue of constantly fighting the same war was undeniable. Maya boarded the plane and found her seat in first class. She sat down, finally allowing herself a moment to exhale. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to fade, leaving behind a lingering bitterness. She glanced around the cabin at the other passengers, some of whom had witnessed the confrontation and now glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and unease. But Maya didn't care about their stares anymore. She had faced far worse in her life. The people on this flight didn't know her story, didn't know what it had taken for her to rise through the ranks of the Marine Corps, to break through barriers that had been set up to keep people like her out.
They didn't know the sacrifices she had made, the countless moments of doubt and dismissal she had endured. But she knew, and that was enough.
As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Maya leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. She thought about the military summit she was heading to, the speech she had prepared, the message she was ready to deliver. It wasn't just about diversity, it was about equity, about making sure that the armed forces reflected the country it was sworn to protect. It was about ensuring that people like her, people who had been overlooked and underestimated, had a place at the table. Maya knew that the fight for equality and justice wasn't confined to the military. It was everywhere. At airports, in boardrooms, in classrooms. The fight was exhausting, but it was necessary. And despite everything she had just gone through, she wasn't going to let this moment derail her mission. As the plane lifted off, leaving the chaos of the airport behind, Maya felt a sense of resolve settle over her. She had asserted her rank, her authority, and her dignity, and she had won. But more importantly, she had reminded herself of her own power that no gate agent, no security officer, and no system of prejudice could take away from her. She wasn't just a passenger on a plane. She was Colonel Maya Roberts, United States Marine Corps, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she had a moment of peace, a moment to reflect. The confrontation at the gate replayed over and over in her head. The disbelief, the frustration, and finally, the anger. She had kept her composure for as long as she could, but she couldn't deny the emotional toll it had taken. She was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. She had spent years fighting against the unspoken barriers that came with being a black woman in the military, always having to prove that she belonged, that she was more than capable. Her accomplishments should have been enough, her rank, her service, her leadership. But in that moment at the gate, none of it seemed to matter. Her entire identity had been reduced to the color of her skin. Maya closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the feelings of resentment and anger aside. It wasn't easy. The injustice of it all sat heavy on her chest, like a weight that refused to lift. She had faced racism before. This wasn't new. But the overt nature of this particular incident stung in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her. It was about the systemic biases that led to situations like this, where people like her were questioned, doubted, and scrutinized, simply for existing in spaces where others didn't think they belonged. The security officer's words echoed in her mind. Someone like you. The phrase had been like a punch to the gut. She had heard similar things throughout her life, but it never got easier. No matter how many battles she won, there was always a new one waiting just around the corner. No matter how high she climbed, there were always people ready to question her right to be there. She opened her eyes and stared out the window, watching the clouds drift by. The plane was quiet, and most of the passengers settled in for the flight. She had always found solace in the stillness of the skies, but now, even the familiar hum of the engines couldn't quiet the storm inside her. She thought about the summit she was heading to, the speech she would give, and the message she would deliver. Her focus had been on diversity in the military, on the need for more voices like hers in positions of power and leadership. But now, in the wake of what had just happened, the importance of her mission felt even more urgent. The very thing she was fighting for had just played out in front of her in the most blatant way possible. As the flight continued, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this incident would follow her for a long time. And she was right. By the time the plane landed, the videos had already gone viral. As soon as she touched down, Maya's phone buzzed incessantly. As she walked through the terminal, her feet heavy with exhaustion. She had barely stepped off the plane when the notifications started flooding in. Texts, emails, missed calls. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were just routine messages. But as the buzz continued, she realized something was off. She opened her phone to find her social media feed swamped with notifications. Her name was everywhere, trending on platforms she barely used. Clips of the confrontation at the gate were circulating rapidly, with thousands, no, millions, of views. People were outraged. The video of her standing firm, asserting her rank as a colonel in the United States Marine Corps, had struck a chord with the public. Her calm but powerful confrontation had resonated, and the internet had taken notice. Comments flooded in from all directions. Some praised her for standing her ground with grace and dignity, commending her for not losing control despite the blatant racism she had faced. Others condemned the airline and the security personnel for their treatment of her, calling for accountability and systemic change. It was a firestorm of support, outrage, and disbelief. Maya's breath hitched as she scrolled through the messages. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted to become the center of a viral moment, a symbol for something larger than herself. All she had wanted was to board her flight and get to her destination in peace. But now, her face and her name were everywhere, her story being shared across the globe. The media had picked it up too. News outlets were running the story, and reporters were already reaching out, wanting her to comment, to share her side of the experience. Civil rights organizations had taken notice, with some calling for action against the airline. Military officials, some of whom were attending the same summit she was heading to, had also reached out, offering support and expressing their dismay at what had happened. She found a quiet corner of the airport and sat down, resting her head in her hands. The attention was overwhelming. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this, for the sudden surge of media interest, for the role people now wanted her to play. She wasn't sure if she wanted to step into the spotlight and become the face of a movement, to bear the weight of expectations that came with it. Part of her just wanted to move on, to leave this incident behind and focus on the work that had always driven her, advocating for diversity and equity in the military. But she knew that this was bigger than her now. People were looking at her, waiting to see how she would respond. This was no longer just about her personal experience. It had become a symbol of something larger, something systemic. As she sat there, her phone buzzing relentlessly, Maya's mind raced with the possibilities. She knew she had a platform now, a voice that people were paying attention to. But what would she do with it? Would she speak out and use this moment to amplify the message she had been fighting for her entire career? Or would she step back, protect her peace, and let the storm pass? The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but Maya knew one thing for sure. She had to decide quickly. The media wasn't going to wait. The world wasn't going to wait. Just then, her phone rang, the name of a well-known news anchor flashing across the screen. She hesitated, staring at the phone as it buzzed in her hand. This was it. The moment where she had to choose. Maya let the call ring out, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone down on the table in front of her. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She needed time to process and to think. This wasn't a decision she could make lightly. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as the noise of the airport faded into the background. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to sit in the quiet before the inevitable storm of media attention came crashing down on her. She knew that whatever decision she made would have consequences. If she spoke out, she would be stepping into the role of a public figure, a voice for others who had experienced similar injustices. But with that came a responsibility she wasn't sure she wanted. If she stayed quiet, she could protect herself from the scrutiny and the pressure, but she would also be passing up an opportunity to affect real change. The conflicting emotions tugged at her from both sides. She had spent her entire career advocating for diversity and equality, and now she had the chance to take that message to a larger audience than she had ever imagined. But at what cost? The buzz of her phone pulled her out of her thoughts once again, and she glanced down to see another message, a request for an interview from a major news network. It wasn't just her friends and colleagues reaching out anymore. The world wanted to hear her story. Maya stood up, her legs shaky from the weight of the decision looming over her. She slipped her phone into her pocket and walked toward the exit, the cool air outside a welcome relief from the chaos inside the terminal. She needed space. She needed clarity. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the summit, to the speech she was preparing to give. She had always believed in the power of her voice and in the importance of her message. But now, with the eyes of the world on her, she wondered if she was ready to carry that burden. The sound of her phone buzzing again broke through the silence. This time, she didn't ignore it. She pulled it out, stared at the screen for a moment, and then, with a deep breath, she answered.
Hello, Colonel Roberts. We've been trying to reach you. We'd like to hear your side of the story.
Maya listened, her heart pounding in her chest. She had a choice to make. as her eyes glazed over and she fell into a deep stare. It was like, for the first time in what felt forever, she knew exactly what she needed to do. After much reflection and encouragement from friends, colleagues, and civil rights advocates, Maya made her decision. She would speak out. She would take this opportunity to address not only her experience, but the larger, more pervasive issues that had been exposed by it. She would hold a press conference. As she prepared for the event, Maya sat in her hotel room, crafting her speech. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment, she wasn't sure where to start. How could she condense a lifetime of battles into a few short paragraphs? How could she turn this deeply personal experience into something that resonated with people from all walks of life? She took a deep breath, thinking about the audience that would soon be listening to her. Some of them for the first time, others who had followed her career and respected her work. But it wasn't just about them. It was about all the people who hadn't been given a voice, the ones who had been silenced by the very systems meant to protect them. Maya began typing, the words flowing from her as if they had been waiting to be spoken all her life. The day of the press conference arrived, and Maya stood at the podium, the lights of the cameras flashing as reporters gathered in front of her. The room was packed. Military officials, civil rights advocates, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had been drawn by the viral video of her confrontation. She had become a symbol of something much bigger than herself, and now it was time to speak. The room fell silent as Maya stepped forward, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloak. She adjusted the microphone and took a deep breath. This was it.
Good afternoon,
Maya began, her voice calm but filled with the authority she had earned over decades of service.
Thank you all for being here today. I want to start by saying that this isn't just about what happened to me at the airport. This is about something much larger, something that has affected far too many people for far too long.
The room was completely still, every eye on her, every person hanging on her words.
For over 2 decades, I've proudly served this country as a member of the United States Marine Corps. I've fought for my country, for freedom, for justice. And yet, even as I've risen through the ranks, even as I've proven myself time and time again, I've faced obstacles that had nothing to do with my abilities, my character, or my commitment to service. Those obstacles were placed in front of me simply because of the color of my skin and my gender.
Her voice didn't waver as she spoke the truth that had weighed on her for years.
What happened to me at that airport wasn't just an isolated incident. It wasn't just a mistake made by a few individuals. It was a reflection of the systemic biases that continue to exist in institutions across this country. Biases that affect not just me, but millions of others who are judged, dismissed, and disrespected because of who they are.
Maya paused, letting her words sink in.
Racism and sexism are not just problems of the past. They are alive and well, thriving in places where they should have no place, in our schools, our workplaces, our justice system, and yes, even in our military. And until we confront these issues head on, until we hold these institutions accountable for the harm they cause, nothing will change.
She could see the impact of her words in the faces of those in the audience, some nodding in agreement, others looking somber as the weight of her message settled over them.
I stand here today not just as Colonel Maya Roberts, not just as a Marine, but as a Black woman who has experienced firsthand what it means to be underestimated, to be doubted, and to be denied the respect I have earned. But I also stand here as someone who is committed to change. I'm not here to tear down the institutions that I've dedicated my life to. I'm here to challenge them to be better, to do better.
Her voice grew stronger as she continued.
I call on every institution in this country, whether it's an airline, a corporation, a school, or a government agency, to take a hard look at the biases that are embedded within their systems. This is not just about diversity for the sake of diversity. It's about equity. It's about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has the same opportunities to succeed and is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve.
Maya paused again, her eyes scanning the room, seeing the ripple of emotion that her words were causing.
This fight isn't new, and it won't be easy, but it's necessary. And I stand here today, not just for myself, but for every person who has been marginalized, silenced, or told that they don't belong. This is our fight, and we will not stop until real, meaningful change is achieved.
As she finished, the room erupted in applause. Some people stood, clapping vigorously, while others wiped away tears. Her words had struck a chord, not just with those in the room, but with people across the country. The media, which had come expecting a response to the airport incident, now had a much larger story to tell. Maya's speech had become a rallying cry, a call for accountability and action in the face of systemic injustice. In the days that followed, Maya's speech reverberated across the country. News outlets played clips of her powerful words, and social media was flooded with posts praising her bravery, her resilience, and her refusal to stay silent. Civil rights leaders commended her for using her platform to speak out, while military officials praised her for holding both herself and the institutions she served accountable. The airline, faced with mounting public pressure, issued a formal apology. They pledged to implement diversity and bias training for their staff, acknowledging that what had happened to Maya was unacceptable. But for Maya, the apology, though necessary, wasn't enough. Real change, she knew, wouldn't come from a single training session or a public statement. It would require a long, sustained effort, a commitment to addressing the deep-rooted biases that had led to the incident in the first place. As the news cycle continued, Maya began receiving invitations to speak at various events. Civil rights organizations, military conferences, universities, they all wanted to hear from her. They wanted her to share her story, her perspective, and her vision for how to move forward. At first, she was hesitant. She had never seen herself as a public figure, someone who spoke on stages and appeared on television. She had always preferred to lead quietly, letting her actions speak for her. But now, she realized, her voice was needed. People were listening, and she had a responsibility to use this platform for good. Over the next few months, Maya embraced this new role. She traveled the country, speaking at conferences and forums, sharing her story, and advocating for systemic change. She spoke not just about the racism and sexism she had faced, but about the broader societal issues that continued to hold people back. She called for accountability, for transparency, and for institutions to take a hard look at the ways in which they perpetuated inequality.
And as she stood in front of crowds of people, some military, some civilian, she felt a sense of purpose that was deeper than anything she had felt before.
One day, as Maya prepared for yet another speaking engagement, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The frustration, the anger, the exhaustion. It had all been part of a larger fight. A fight for herself, for her fellow Marines, for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. As she walked onto the stage, the bright lights shining down on her, Maya knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, challenges, and moments where progress seemed impossible. But she was ready. She stood tall, her head held high, and as she began to speak, she felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. This was her moment, and she was going to use it to make sure that no one else would ever have to fight the same battles she had fought alone. The road to justice was long, but Maya was ready for the journey.